about efficiency. In markets. Specifically, when we mentioned efficiency before, we talked about it as getting the most out of whatever resources you have. And so in the production responsibility frontier model, we talked about this in terms of being on the frontier, on the edge of the curve, right? Not being inside of it. Inside would be inefficient. When we talk about efficiency in markets, what we're talking about is, are we producing the right amount of stuff? Are we allocating our resources in the best way? And so we're going to come back to this point about efficiency kind of throughout the semester, but it's going to be especially clear when we start talking about externalities, both spillover costs and spillover benefits, and then when we talk about public goods as well, and we're going to talk about those a little bit more next week. The other thing that we're going to talk about then is taxes and regulations. And talk about how we model this within the market model. Specifically, we're going to do an example using that falafel case study with that supply and demand that we had before. But then also we're going to apply that a little bit later on when we talk about marijuana legalization. In the textbook, they talk about crime in general. I mean, I want to talk about this one specific case study. And to ask the question is, first, the question that it will ask is, will the price increase or decrease for marijuana once it's legalized? And so you think about a state like Colorado that is now recreational marijuana usage is now legal. You can go into these shops that are just basically everywhere right next to grocery stores and such and go in and buy legal marijuana. And the question is, would the price increase or decrease due to legalization? And then the second thing is, will quantity increase and decrease? And then the final thing is this good or is this bad? Ask that normative question of whether or not this is a good thing. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about somewhat of a technical subject, but it's one that's very important in determining whether or not these taxes and regulations and their overall effect, or something like marijuana legalization, who's going to really pay for it, matters. And that has to do with this concept of elasticity. Understanding elasticity is something we're just going to barely touch on in this class, but if you took a principles of microeconomics class, it's something you deal a lot with. And it is one of these concepts that's not necessarily intuitive immediately, but it's very, very useful when talking about economic issues in microeconomics. So first thing I want to talk a little bit about is just efficiency. Now, when we're talking about market efficiency, I think the best way to conceptualize this is to think about it in terms of the supply and demand analysis that we've had already. So specifically, if we think about price or dollars per unit of output being on our y-axis, and we think about the quantity over a period of time being on our x-axis, we typically think of the fact that we have a downward sloping demand curve and an upward sloping supply curve. Now, where efficiency comes in is to ask the question whether or not we're producing the right Q. That this market outcome where we have an equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity, whether or not that in some way is good for society, if we're producing the right amount of stuff. And we said that, we've talked about how we'll get to that equilibrium. So for example, you can imagine the case where what happens if we start off with a price that's above the equilibrium price? What do we have then? What's going to be the case? Let's say if this is my falafel, my falafel cart, and I know the equilibrium price now is $6, but let's say I started off and I started charging $8. What would happen? I would have low demand. I'd have relatively low demand in compared to supply. So if I start off above that equilibrium price, I have the situation where quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded, or in other words, I would have a surplus, right? If I started off too low, my quantity supplied would be relatively low compared to the quantity demanded, so I didn't have a shortage. And recognizing the shortage, I would then increase my price the next time, or if I started off too high, recognizing the surplus, I would lower my price until we get to the equilibrium, right? It's kind of like this point that we end up in. And I often talk about it in terms of, not to think about this as 2 dimensions, but think about it as 3 dimensions. And this point where the 2 lines cross is really at the bottom of the bowl. And so if you start off with a price-quantity combination somewhere up here, eventually it'll kind of roll around until you get down to that intersection of the supply and demand curve, and that's going to be the only resting point. So an equilibrium is not magical in any way, it's just a resting point. It's the only place in the market where there's no incentive for someone to change their behavior. At that price, the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded. Consumers know that they can't do any better off. Producers can't do any better off if they try to change the price. So it's just a point of rest. So that's how we think about the equilibrium. Now the question we ask is this equilibrium good in some way? Is it the right amount that we should be producing? Is it efficient? And so the way to think about this is to stretch our thinking about the supply and demand curve. And what I want you to do is to think about the following. That we can think about the supply curve as being the same thing as the marginal cost curve. So MC stands for marginal cost. That the MC, the marginal cost curve, is in fact the supply curve. Now, why is that? Well, let's think about it this way. The supply curve tells us at any given price, how much will the firm be willing to supply? That, with the falafel example, at $2, the firm was willing to supply 5, at 4 is willing to supply 15, etc. Well, let's think about the other way. In order to cover my costs, I know that I have to be, I'm only willing to produce 5 units, in that case before, if I was paid $2. So what must be the marginal cost of my production of that 5th unit if I have to be paid $2 to be willing to produce 5? So that $2 has to cover my costs. So the idea is that if I'm only willing to produce 5 at a price of 2, it must be the case that $2 is my marginal cost of that 5th unit. If my marginal cost was lower than that, then I'd be willing to produce more. If my marginal cost was higher than that, then I wouldn't be willing to produce that 5th unit. So the supply curve is in fact the marginal cost curve as well. Now that's a concept that gets built upon a lot more in the principles of microeconomics class, and they show you how that really works. But at this point, you can kind of take it as, take it with a grain of salt. The supply curve is the marginal cost curve. Marginal in this case only means incremental, so it's of the next unit, and that is equal to the supply curve. Well, very similarly, we can talk about the demand curve equaling the marginal benefit curve. Again, why would someone be willing to pay $10 for a falafel sandwich? Well, it must be because they benefit from it by that amount, that they're willing to give up $10 of other goods in order to consume that falafel sandwich. So why is it that for the next one that someone would be willing to pay, it would be lower? For the next unit of production, someone would be willing to pay less. Well, think about it this way. Right? The marginal cost of the marginal cost and benefit of something very similar, very common like water is pretty low, right? So if you think about just tap water, and you think about a gallon of tap water that you could get, how much would you be willing to pay for that?
I guess it would depend on the situation.
It depends a lot on the situation. So right now, with nothing else changing the situation, if someone just said, hey, I'm carrying around a gallon of tap water and you're right next to your dorm room or your house or whatever, how much would you be willing to pay?
Not much at all.
Not much at all, right? So think about the same scenario, but you wake up the next morning and you try your tap and it's not working. You turn on the TV and it seems like there's no water in the town of Hattiesburg, that either the pipes are busted or something's dried up or aliens have taken all the water, and then someone comes up to you and says, hey, here's a gallon of tap water, how much would you be willing to pay? A lot more, because your first gallon of water in a given day has a really high marginal benefit. Every other gallon that you're going to use has a lower marginal benefit. That first one is going to allow you to survive for the rest of the day. Then eventually, if the price is low enough, then you might actually take a shower or cook some food with it or something else. But the very first unit has a really high marginal benefit, and the last unit is a fairly low one. So we can think about the demand curve as also representing the marginal benefit to society. So we have a demand curve, that's the marginal benefit. We have a supply curve, that's the marginal cost. And so what we're seeing here is that at that point where supply is equal to demand, is we get marginal benefit is equal to marginal cost at the market equilibrium. Now, let's use this fact, so we have supply equal to demand, quantity supplied is equal to quantity demand at that equilibrium, and to ask the question, is this then efficient? Well, think about a situation where if Q, so any given quantity that we have, is less than QE, the equilibrium amount, right? So we're somewhere over here, and we'll just pick a value, call it Q1, like that. Now here, what's the relationship between marginal benefit and marginal cost at Q1? Which one's bigger? So if for some Q that's less than QE, like Q1 over here, marginal benefit is greater than marginal cost. All right. So what's another way of thinking about it? Well, the value to an individual for producing that next unit is greater than the cost to the producers, because the marginal cost is lower than the marginal benefit. So would society be better off at Q1 or somewhere to the right of Q1?
Somewhere to the right.
Somewhere to the right, because here we're benefiting, let's say, $8. Like someone would be willing to pay $8 for this, whatever it is, falafel sandwich or whatever, and it's only costing the producer $3 to actually produce it. So if it's not produced, then we're losing this kind of surplus value, this gravy, this consumer surplus is one way to think about it, between $8, how much someone's willing to pay, and $3, which is what the cost of production is. And if we don't produce that next one, we lose that. So it's better to produce somewhere to the right. And you keep on producing up until the point where marginal benefits equal to marginal cost, or where supply is equal to demand. Because so long as marginal benefits greater than marginal cost, society's better off by producing more. Now let's think about, in that case, we have marginal benefit greater than marginal cost. And the last one to think about is where Q is greater than QE, then we get marginal cost being greater than marginal benefit. So over here, let's take this Q2, sorry, it's supposed to be 2. Here, the cost of producing that last unit may be $10, but someone's only willing to pay $3 for it. So if the cost of production is greater than the benefit to society for that last one, is society better off by being there or somewhere to the left? Yeah, somewhere to the left. And you can keep on doing that thought experiment until you get back to the equilibrium. So what we get out of this is that the market equilibrium is in fact our allocatively efficient point. That if we're anywhere else, if we're at any other Q besides QE, we could be doing better by being at that point. All right, so that's one of the basic fundamental kind of like facts or principles of economics, is that generally competitive markets do pretty well in allocating resources to where they're going to have the most value. However, there are certain cases where it's not. And we talked about these last time, cases where the government might want to get involved. One of which was what?
Minimum wage.
Minimum wage was a possible case, and that's an equity concern, right? And so that's a good concern because that is something that we want to play off of. It's not an efficiency concern, but it's an equity concern, and that is a major one. So in terms of efficiency concerns, we have other things though. Remember there's the case of spillover benefits and spillover costs, which we'll talk more about in Chapter 3 and Chapter 4, and the case of public goods. In both of those, the market doesn't allocate properly. And we'll show specifically how the market screws things up left alone. In general, the market does pretty well, don't need the government involved, but if there is a spillover cost or a spillover benefit, that requires the government to get involved. All right. For efficiency reasons, not for equity reasons. You can have both reasons to get involved, but in terms of efficiency reasons, you need to have some sort of spillover cost, spillover benefit, or public good. Any questions about that? All right, so let's now apply this and talk specifically about the case of taxes. What I'd like to do with this is do a numerical example and show you how we model a tax increase or the imposition of a tax in a market, and then talk about its efficiency, little tongue tied, about its relevance to efficiency. So, talking about taxes and regulations. So, let me go ahead and use the same supply and demand schedule as we used last time. And that'll give us supply curve and demand curve that I can draw here. So this is for falafel sandwiches, dollars per falafel sandwich, number of sandwiches, so I think it worked pretty well. We used the colors last time. Let's see. Not using all of that graph, but all right. So I'm only going to use a portion of this because obviously I didn't scale that quite effectively, but we'll be using this little part of the graph. That'll be fine. Remember our supply curve such that at the price of 5, willing to produce, sorry, at the price of 2, willing to produce 5, at a price of 4, willing to produce 15, 6, 25, 8, 35, 10, 45. So we had a supply curve that looked like that. And we had a demand curve that basically so we have the supply curve and the demand curve. Trying to make that a little more accurate. There we go. Okay. So those are our supply and demand for falafel sandwiches that we've drawn before. Now the question is let's say, so you guys have heard of like fat taxes and soda taxes? Know about these? So like Mexico imposed a tax on all carbonated beverages. Like all sodas, all sweetened carbonated beverages have to pay a certain per liter tax now. And the state of California has looked at this before. I think it might come up in this election. I know Oregon has looked at it. I can't remember whether or not Oregon passed anything, but this is very common. And the idea, as we'll talk about next time, has to do with negative externalities associated with doing something like drinking sugary drinks. That this is seen as something that causes health problems, and those health problems end up costing the government a certain amount of money through the health system, and therefore they're trying to discourage the consumption of sugary beverages. By the way, this does not have sugar. However, and it's not even like sweetened in any way, right? It's just water. However, let's say they go to another extreme on this, and instead of just saying sugary beverages, what in fact they want is anything that's fatty, we're going to put a tax on. Falafel sandwiches, I love them, but they're not the best thing for you. They're deep fried balls of chickpea. They're pretty bad for you. So they're going to impose a $2 per sandwich tax on falafels. How do we model this? And the question becomes, first of all, think about it. How do we model this? How do we actually show this? But then secondly, what's going to happen to price and what's going to happen to quantity? Again, you start off with the market, you change it up in some way, something else happens, we impose a tax. What's going to happen to price? What's going to happen to quantity? Let's look at this. So here we have the schedule that implies that supply curve and that demand curve. Now we're going to have something that changes in the system, and we want to somehow model that on here. The first question to ask is, do you think the supply curve will change, or do you think the demand curve will change? Demand curve? Demand curve? Right. The fact is, it doesn't matter which way you go, but intuitively, it makes more sense to me to have the supply curve shift. Okay. So the reason why is, think about it this way. Who's going to actually have to pay the government this tax?
Producers.
The producers will, right? So when you go to Junior Food Mart, again, it's now that I can actually see it out the window, I'm going to use Junior Food Mart anymore. When you go to Junior Food Mart, buy yourself a Snickers bar, they're going to charge you sales tax on it, right? And instead of being 99 cents, it's going to cost you $1.06 or $1.07 or something like that. They have to then turn around and write a check to the government. So when they are pricing something, they add on that tax and they receive that money from you, but they're going to pass it along. Likewise, if we think about the firms being the ones that have to pass this along to the government, it makes more sense to think about it as the suppliers are actually having to change their supply schedule. So the question is, how much are you willing to receive in order to be able to produce a certain amount? And the way I like to think about this is that when you add on a tax, so let's say plus $2 sandwich tax, what's going to happen? Now, before, a firm was willing to produce 5 sandwiches if they received $2 from the consumer. All right? Now, if they receive $2 from the consumer, will they be willing to produce 5 still? Why not? Where do they have to send those $2? They have to send all that money to the government, so receiving $2 from a consumer is the same thing as receiving $0 previously. And likewise, if they receive 4, it's the same thing as receiving $2 previously. 6 is the same thing as receiving $4 previously, etc. And so we have this change in our supply schedule. We're now at 2. They're not willing to produce anything. At 4, they would only be willing to produce 5. At 6, they'd be willing to produce 15, 8, 25, and at 10, they'd be willing to produce 35. Because now, when they receive $10, they have to ship $2 off of that back to the government, so it's the equivalent of what they were doing before when they received $8. Does that make sense? So now they have to give some of that money to the government, so they don't get to keep all of it. So the price that consumers pay is different than the price that the sellers receive, that the sellers get to keep. And because of that wedge, we could model this either way, but I like doing it on the supply side a little bit more. I think the answer that we get is a little bit more intuitive. All right, so what do we get? Well, now we have this new supply schedule, and so let's go ahead and map that out. At $4, they're willing to produce 5. At $6, they're willing to produce 15. At $8, they're willing to produce 25. And at $10, they're willing to produce 35. So we now have S prime instead of S. So the supply curve has shifted which way?
Left.
To the left, right? So imposing a tax on a market shifts the supply curve to the left. All right. Now we have this shift in the supply curve. Now what's going to happen to the equilibrium price and quantity with the tax? Well, now instead of being at 25 for a quantity and 6 for our price, we're now going to get 7 for our price and 20 for a quantity. That's going to be the new intersection. And if we think about it, we can rewrite this new supply curve and the new supply schedule and the old demand curve with all the intermediate combinations, and I think you can see how this lines up. So let's go price. Instead of starting at 2, let's go ahead and start at 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. The quantity demanded then is going to be 0, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, and 45. So it's the same demand schedule, but I've just added the odd numbers on the price. So it's the same ones. I'm just adding in the intermediate values. Everyone sees that? Okay. And now this new supply schedule, at a price of 1, you're not willing to produce. At 2, you're not willing to produce. At 3, you're not willing to produce. And at 4, you're only willing to produce 5. And then we go up in 5 increments from there. Just a second. Okay, why am I off? Okay. At 3, you're willing to produce 0. And 5, 10. Did I mess this up somehow? Oh, this is. You guys just let me do that. I made an upward sloping demand schedule here. Because before, yeah. Duh. Okay. Okay, I will write wrong things on the board every now and then. You guys have to just catch me. Okay, 50, 45, 40. Like, that is not right at all. 35, 30, 25, 20. Now we're getting there. 15, 10, 5. And now we go 10. I'll go ahead and do it in red just to make it clear. 15, 20, 25, 30, 35. All right. So this is this new supply curve with the old demand curve. And as you'll see, the equilibrium is where the price at which the new supply curve is equal to, the new quantity supply is equal to the old quantity demanded, which is going to be at $7.20. You don't seem to be nodding your head. You seem to be frowning. Questions? Anything I can clarify? Yes.
Are those numbers always going to be the same on the demand? Like for all the models that you use?
No, this is just happens to be, this is very arbitrary, right? So I'm using the same one just for consistency's sake.
Okay. Right? I was a little confused on where the numbers were coming from, so I was just going.
No, this is just a hypothetical, okay. I've just made this up, right?
All right.
So on the quiz, I think I give you either different supply or different demand, and that's the sort of thing that I'll give. I'll just give you a different schedule, and then you have to figure out what's going on with equilibrium price and quantity. All right, question? No? All right, so what's happened to price and what's happened to quantity, right? That's where we're going with this. So price has
Risen.
Increased, and quantity has decreased, right? So a supply curve shifting to the left, that's what you'd expect to happen. Now, the reason why I think it's more intuitive to do it on the supply side of things is in order to get quantity to decrease, right? We know quantity has to decrease. What would have to happen for the demand curve to be able to show what's going on with the tax? Which way would it have to shift? It'd have to go to the left. The difference is the interpretation of that price. Here we're showing the price that consumers pay. Like how much are you paying to Junior Food Mart when you're paying with the tax? Right? You're paying the $1.10 or the $1.20, whatever it is, with the tax added on. That's what we're showing here. In the case of the demand curve shifting, what you end up having to show is what the sellers get to keep. And what's happened here is the price has increased, but the price has increased only in terms of what the buyers are having to pay. How much do the producers actually get to keep out of that $7?
$5.
$5, right. So consumers pay $7, producers only get to keep $5 though. And so you would have to reinterpret that price on the y-axis there in terms of, from the seller's perspective, they would only get to keep $5 because you'd be showing a leftward shift in the demand curve. And that's just less intuitive to me. It makes more sense to think about it in terms of that's the price that consumers are paying. And if you want to see where sellers are getting to keep, well, then you drop down at that quantity back to the original supply curve. That gap between the vertical gap between the new supply curve and the old one, that is your tax. So the curve shifted by 2 units up. It's a leftward shift, I know, we need to stick with that logic, but if you think about it, it's 2 units above the old one. Now, for that reason, how much of the tax do consumers pay and how much do producers pay? Like, it's a $2 tax, but how much are consumers paying of that $2? Do they pay the whole thing?
Yeah.
No, consumers don't. How much were they paying before?
I'll just pay $1 of it.
They're only paying $1 of it, right? They used to be paying $6 for the sandwiches. Now they're having to pay $7. Now some consumers are going to get priced out of the market. So these folks that weren't willing to pay the $7, right? They kind of are screwed over too. So we need to incorporate them in this whole story. But they only pay $1 more for their sandwiches. Where does the other dollar come from? Well, it comes from the producers who have to receive less for their goods. Now, why is it that producers have to pay anything? And this is going to get us to our story about elasticities in a little bit. Well, think about it. If I'm a producer and the government all of a sudden comes in and says, you're going to have to pay $2 per unit sold back to the government. Well, I was selling my sandwiches at $6. Now I'm going to turn around and say, okay, you guys have to pay $8 per sandwich. All right? Am I going to be able to sell the same number of sandwiches as I did before? No, because of course demand curve sloped down. So if I just raise my price to 8, then the supply will be over here, or the supply will be right there because I'm just doing this vertically. Demand is going to be much lower, right? At a price of 8, demand will only be 15. So I'm willing to still sell 25 at that price, but they're only willing to buy 15. And so now I'm stuck in that situation again where I have a surplus. How do you get rid of the surplus? Well, you have to lower your price. So if I start off over here at 8, then I have to lower my price until I sell off all the rest of my surplus, so I lower it down to 7. Now, what determines how much do the consumers pay and how much do the producers pay? It's the relative steepness of these curves. In other words, how responsive is demand or supply to price changes, and that is the definition of elasticity that we're going to talk about in a little bit. So the relative elasticities, the relative responsiveness of consumers and producers to price changes is what determines how much of any tax a producer or consumer pays. All right, we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but that's the punchline at the end of this. Any questions about that? And the easiest way to think about it is what would happen if we had a perfectly vertical demand curve? Who would pay for it then? If it's perfectly vertical. The consumers would, right? Because then you could pass on the $2 tax increase onto the consumers, because guess what? They're still going to buy the same amount regardless of what the price is. That's what that vertical demand curve means. And that's what we refer to as perfectly inelastic. All right. Let's talk a little bit about marijuana legalization and criminalization. So as of right now, the current law in the land, that something like 23 or 24 states have decriminalized medical marijuana, and another 2 to 3, depending upon the looseness of the laws you want to interpret, have legalized recreational use of marijuana. Now, this is a major change in U.S. policy, and it's one of these debates where, like, actually, talking to my kids and talking to my friends and stuff. The question, like, when we moved to Mississippi, did we think gay marriage would be legal first, or that marijuana would be legal first in the state of Mississippi? And I think most people would have said, well, probably marijuana would be legal. But of course, there hasn't been a Supreme Court hearing about that. So I still think marijuana legalization is many, many years down the road in the state of Mississippi, but it could always happen.
We were one of the first states to decriminalize that.
In terms of making a misdemeanor only?
for a traffic ticket. As long as you're not in the car, it's not even a misdemeanor. It's
Oh,
like
really?
Just on you. It's
So less than, what is it?
It's like
Less than,
a stop sign ticket. If you're in a car, it's a misdemeanor. It's possession of marijuana in a motor vehicle.
huh.
If you got like 30 grams, like less than 30 or something.
Yeah.
So it's like, it's about an ounce, is like 30 grams, yeah.
It's a certain like weight limit, yeah.
Which is interesting, I didn't actually realize that. Because at one point I was with my sister, and she has migraine headaches, and so she was smoking. This was like back in the 80s or something, like a long, long time ago. She's older than me, but she was like maybe in her early 30s or something. And she was like, we were at Lake Tahoe, which is right on the Nevada-California border. And she's like, wait a second, do you know which side we're on? I said, why? She's like, I'm going to smoke, and I need to know, just in case I get busted, it matters a lot which side of the line you're on, because in Nevada it hadn't been decriminalized, but in California it had been at the time. So yeah, that sort of stuff does actually matter quite a bit. So if we think about this in terms of legalization, and the opposite of it, think about is criminalization. Or not quite the opposite, but I'm going to use those terms as opposites. Use this in terms of quantity, in terms of, let's say, some unit of weight, like grams, pounds, whatever we want to talk about. And think about our demand curve and supply curve. And let's talk about these before legalization. So this is demand before legalization and supply before legalization. So demand before legalization, supply before legalization. There's a price, there's a quantity that was the equilibrium. Sorry, price and quantity. Okay, and then we had an equilibrium. Now the question becomes, what's going to happen with legalization? So we go to Colorado. So in the summer of 14, I took a trip to Colorado for like doing this. I often run races. I do distance running and stuff. And so my buddy that I run with in the summer, we go either to somewhere usually somewhere in the Mountain West, right? Because it's nicer weather. He's living in Austin. I'm living in Mississippi. No one wants to run in Austin or in Mississippi more than like 5 miles during the summer. So we go out to Colorado, and we went out for like this running camp out there. And all of us, we'd been to Colorado a couple years before, and all of a sudden it's a completely different landscape. Like you go to a Kroger, right, with a couple like little, not convenience stores, but other little shops on each end of it, and there are like 3 or 4 dispensaries like right there, like within, half a mile even, just right there. So it's all over the place. Now the question is, well, can we use the supply and demand analysis to make predictions about what's going to happen with legalization? And how would we show that? So the first thing to think about is, will supply increase or decrease, and will demand increase or decrease? And then the final thing is, then what does that mean about price and quantity? All right, so supply. Which way do you think it's going to go?
Has to increase
So it would have to increase. And now why is that?
because someone has to produce it for more since it's going to be legal.
But think about it.
More of it.
Well, think about it in terms of that about those things that shift the supply curve, right?
I don't know the current supply of it. So, I mean, once we actually get an actual
The number of producers is going to go up.
Well, the number of producers would go up, right? So that's going to be one thing. Now, why is the number of producers going to go up, though? What was inhibiting the market and the supply before?
Because it was illegal.
Okay, and what does that mean? It doesn't exist? Clearly not, right? Everyone knows. Gary Johnson. You guys know who Gary Johnson is? So Gary Johnson is the former governor of New Mexico, and he was also the 2012 presidential candidate on the Libertarian ticket. And one of his big things was, legalization of marijuana across the entire 50 states. And he came and gave a talk here in the Honors Forum or the University Forum last year, like fall of 14. And this poor kid, this kid goes up there and he's just like, but marijuana is bad. And she's like, yes, but your friends are smoking it already. It's just an issue of whether or not we should be jailing them for as long because they're doing this thing basically to themselves, right? So The idea is that people are already smoking, but there is an inhibition on the supply. What is keeping more people from supplying right now? Why do people not supply as much?
Go to jail.
Because they'll go to jail. So think about it in terms of like this price and quantity story. For every dollar that you get, selling weed, right? Every $10, every $100 you get for selling weed, there's a possibility that you're going to go to jail. And if you go to jail, is the price just $10 that you have to receive? Or do you need to get paid some additional premium just because it's scary that you're engaging in this illegal activity and you need to be paid for the risk of possibly going to jail, right? So this idea that there's this risk involved, that it's a risky endeavor, that you might go to jail, means that they have to pay you more than the marginal cost of production. The marginal cost of production may be very low, but because there's this additional thing out there, you have to be paid off, essentially, to incur that risk. So the legalization, so before legalization it might be here, but after legalization, we'd expect the supply curve to shift to the right. Okay. So supply curve with legalization is to the right of the demand, sorry, is to the right of the supply before legalization. How about the demand curve?
Surely right, too.
You think that'd go to the right as well? All right. So if we didn't have the demand curve go to the right, would marijuana consumption increase in states where it's legal compared to before? Just according to this. Yeah. Even if demand didn't change at all. Even if the exact same people would be willing to pay the exact same amount that they were willing to pay before, we would still get an increase. But we'd only get that increase because the demand would be, the quantity demanded at the old price would have been less than the quantity supplied, and that's going to push down the price. However, you would expect more people to actually engage in this market after legalization. Why?
Because they're not scared, there's no risk.
Right, again, there's, how much am I willing to pay for this activity? Well, part of, what I'm paying is not just, for the substance itself. I'm also paying in terms of like, I'm possibly engaging in a risky behavior that's going to cause me to get arrested, right? And so that risk also was damping down demand. And so you get rid of that risk, you'd expect demand to increase. So with legalization, the demand curve is going to be to the right. Now, we unquestionably, we're going to get, therefore, an increase in the quantity bought and sold. That legalization of marijuana, by both increasing the supply of weed and increasing the demand for weed, is going to increase the equilibrium quantity. There's no doubt about that. Okay, so the first question is we know quantity is going to increase. Second question is what's going to happen to price? Is it going to increase or decrease?
Decrease.
It's going to decrease in the way I've drawn it here, because which one has shifted more, the supply curve or the demand curve? The supply curve. Which do we expect to happen? Supply or demand curve to shift more?
Demand.
You expect demand? I would think supply, right? I think that the restriction really was mostly on suppliers. That people that wanted to buy weed mostly could get it if they wanted to. Maybe they were a little bit hesitant to do so, but people that really want to could get it. Now, maybe it's increased some just because more people are going to be willing to experiment, because it's not risky, there's less of a taboo against it. Maybe some people would actually not want to smoke it if there's no taboo, right? Maybe that's part of the thrill of engaging in illegal drugs. However, my guess ahead of time was the demand curve would shift less than the supply curve. There's actually a website, and I forget the exact name of it right now, but it's like, how much does weed cost or something like that. And you can look at the different states, and you can look at Oregon, what's happened to the price of weed after, or actually Washington State, what's happened to the price of weed after legalization. In Colorado, what's happened to the price of weed after legalization. Well, not surprisingly, the two cheapest places to get weed in the entire country right now are Washington State and Colorado, right? Largely because we've had the supply increase greater than the demand increase in those two states, right? And again, we watch something, we watch quantity increase and we watch price decrease, we can say, oh, what must have happened is that there's more of a supply effect than a demand effect. Now, here's the final question out of this. Is this good or bad? Is there a reason why we wanted the equilibrium to be here rather than here? is society better off or worse off with legalization?
Now it can be in GDP.
Now it could be in GDP, right? I think they had some like kind of shadow GDP calculations that they would do about illegal drugs before. It probably wasn't very accurate. We're going to measure it. Maybe we'll get some more information about it.
It's gonna make money,
It's going to make money. Who's it going to make money for?
producers.
It's going to make money for producers, right? That's definitely true, right? We're going to have more bought and sold at approximately the same price, a little bit lower price, but producers are going to make more money. Taxes as well, right? So this is there's like a 25% tax on this, and so that's going to raise some revenue for the state too, right? We talk about things like gambling in the state of Mississippi. We don't have a lotto, but we have casino gambling, and part of the idea is that it's something that we that we accept that maybe it's not something that we want to sanction because we think it may be immoral or something else, but we can raise some revenue off of it, and people are going to do it anyway. So the government might as well collect some revenue. Is there any other compelling interest? Are there spillover costs or spillover benefits here? That's something to think about for next time, right? Is there a negative externality? Is someone else harmed when more people smoke? And if so, how would we try to control for that? Well, if we really think with legalization that there's some additional harm, one way of controlling for it and cutting back on the quantity would be what?
Raising the price.
We'd raise the price through taxation. That we could actually get us back to this original supply curve and decrease the quantity, not all the way necessarily because demand might have changed still, but we could decrease the quantity by increasing the price through taxation, just like we showed before. You impose a tax in this market, you'd increase the price and decrease quantity. Yeah.
Would that just raise competition between people like me and you, actual businesses?
Oh, as far as like street, people selling on the street versus those that are actually. This is a real question. What's happening to what was the illegal market now that it's been sanctioned by the state? And I think that probably because of the lowering of price, and also because of the additional quality controls that go on for those that are paid for through dispensaries. I think probably the illegal market still exists, but it's been largely wiped away. That it's just much weaker. I mean, still people under 21 can't smoke, so there's still going to be that kind of illegal market that exists. But the other thing to think about is that are we shifting the supply curve all the way back or just a little bit back? And most people think that we're not shifting it that much with these taxes. That the taxes are going to cause a little bit less quantity bought and sold, but we're not going to raise the price to where it was before. And that's what we see actually in those price data too, is that the price has increased compared to what it would be without the tax, but it's still lower than it was before it was legalized. So, and part of the idea is that what happens if we do raise it too much, right? If we raise it too much, well, people were willing to buy and sell back here when it was illegal. So now all of a sudden, you've made more of a market you've made more of an incentive for the illegal market if you tax too much. So that's always something that governments have to take into account when they're thinking about setting taxes. That if they tax too heavily, what's going to end up happening is that you're going to drive all the activity underground. You're not going to get any revenue. It happens with cigarettes too, right? Cigarettes taxes in some states are really, really high. And so what do people do? They buy it in a lower tax state and they smuggle it across the border. There's a famous terrorism case from a number of years ago where basically these homegrown jihadists were financing their terrorist plans by buying cigarettes in North Carolina and driving them up to New York to sell, and they would sell them at below market prices because the taxes in New York were so much higher than the taxes in North Carolina. Right? So you can cause all sorts of problems if you get those taxes way too high. All right, questions about this? Comments? All right. About elasticity, let me just give a couple quick examples and just to give a couple definitions. And we'll talk primarily about demand elasticity. Elasticity just means stretchiness, right? So we think about demand elasticity is the the responsiveness of the quantity demanded to changes in price. Essentially, what we're talking about is whether or not consumers will flee away from buying a good when the price increases, or whether or not they're going to basically buy the same amount. There are two different kind of categories that we think about consumer goods. We can talk about elastic demand, where consumers are very responsive. It's not responsive, responsive. And we can think about inelastic demand, where consumers are not very responsive. The important thing to think about in terms of taxation is that if you're trying to raise revenue, and you're the government agency, right? So you're the Mississippi, Department of Revenue, and you want to say, okay, we need to raise some revenue. All right, we've got this budget shortfall, 1.5% that state agencies are going to have to cut. We're talking about budget cuts here at Southern Miss, talking about budget cuts all throughout the state. Should we raise revenue on a good that has relatively elastic demand or relatively inelastic demand? If our sole goal is to raise revenue.
Well,
Elastic, huh?
If it's elastic, what happens when we raise the price?
You don't want them to be.
The consumers are going to leave, right? So you're not going to be able to raise as much revenue. For any dollar tax increase, people are going to not buy the good as much. For inelastic demand, in that extreme case, you raise the tax on that good, everyone's still going to buy the same amount, you're going to raise lots of revenue. But here's the tricky thing. When we think about inelastically demanded goods, what sorts of goods do people are they willing to pay for regardless of what the price is?
Necessity.
Necessities, right? So necessities are more likely to have inelastic demand. But then you think about kind of like a social, like the social well-being. Do we want to tax things like bread and rice and things that people actually need to live on? We know that's inelastic demand, but if we tax those kind of basic foodstuffs, then we have problems with that. So instead, what you'd like to do is you'd like to tax something that you don't really want to encourage, but people aren't going to stop buying it just because you're taxing it. So what sorts of things do we tax? Alcohol, tobacco, anything that we can think of as a sin tax, we'll throw some, we'll put a tax on that because figure, well, if people consume it less, that's okay. We don't really want them to be consuming it, but in general, people have fairly inelastic demand for things like alcohol because guess what? People that like alcohol are still going to pay, if it's $4 a six-pack or it's $6 a six-pack, they may just be buying different kinds of beer or something like that. So, all right, so just a real quick introduction to elasticity. We're not going to talk a whole lot about it throughout the semester, but it is an important economic concept just to have in your mind. And they do have some more details about it in Chapter 2's appendix. I think they spend a little time reading through that as well. All right, any questions? All right, have a good weekend, guys.